featured in the book. Here he is. This is Elder Crowshoe here. Elder
Oh,
Rich
cool.
Crowshoe. Former chief of the Piikani Nation.
There we go. We are online, much to your surprise. Okay.
Well, that's great.
All right. Let's see if anybody joins us. Okay, we have one joining us now. Let me.
So instead of washing it off, I thought, well, I'll just leave it on since somewhat appropriate.
You earned it.
Perhaps. I earned it.
Yeah, you earned it. That's terrific. Okay. Well, at least there's a couple of us here. And Happy New Year to everybody. And we currently have 6 online and growing. So tonight we have Nancy Pfaff from Reno and Miles Flagg from Calgary, besides Skip so far among our panelists, and I'll be watching for others. What I want to talk about tonight is this article called Jung as Craftsman. Did either of you get a chance to read this article?
I did. I loved it.
Isn't it rich? It's very well done, I think. Let's see here.
Did her writing about Jung and his childhood seem right to you? Is that
absolutely.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah, absolutely. Based on everything that we know about Jung and his childhood from different biographical sources. And she's a Jungian analyst of long standing, probably 40 years or so. She's on the faculty at Pacifica Graduate Institute. She will be at the conference that I'll be attending in Switzerland in April. And so I'm looking forward to that.
Yes.
And to her talk. She's going to talk there. Although I don't have the name of that talk in front of me. But the critical idea here is that in individuation, which is basically, how we grow as a living creature. Okay, all living creatures have a instinct to grow. And part of that instinct for humans relates to our consciousness. But very simply, an oak tree is an oak tree, but all oak trees are different. And so if you plant an acorn, an oak tree will grow, and it will no doubt look like an oak tree, but it will have its limbs and leaves in different places, and it'll be a little different from every other oak tree. So every human being is like that also. And so most of us, I mean by that, most of our parts grow automatically. I mean, we grow our heart, we grow our lungs and all of our bodily parts. And that's all done on automatic. We don't have to do anything about it. Sometimes during our lifetime, then those parts get adjusted, but that isn't actually part of nature. That's something else. And hi, Sandy. Let me get you into Sandy Pelletier, who's one of our new members who came last week. I'm going to promote you to a panelist, so you should be able to come in pretty soon. There she is. Okay, so Sandy is joining us, and she joined us last week. I appreciate that, and instigated some serious discussion last week. And so the point is that we want to encourage everyone to do something creative, because that's how you communicate with yourself. And, it doesn't matter what it is. It can be dance, it can be painting or sculpture or writing or whatever you like. And hi, Jerome, good evening. So I'm just saying that we want everyone, or everyone should, think of creativity as an important part of their life. And Dr. Jung wanted, as he said it, he wanted to do a testimony in stone. And so he built a house around himself. And it was a primitive house, so which didn't have any running water or electricity and no plumbing. And the reason he did that was he wanted to get back and understand his instincts as a basic person rather than being cut off from them, as we humans of the 21st century are pretty much cut off from our instincts. We know to go to the grocery store and go to the bathroom, but those are things that we know how to basically deal with. But most of us wouldn't have a clue about how to stay alive. Because all those things are prepared for us and we just go to the grocery store and buy them. And so Dr. Jung quite early started to understand that. And that's one of the features of the Red Book, is his artwork. And of course, this book behind me here, The Art of C.G. Jung, goes back and covers his art from, I think, age 6 or 7 through his lifetime. And his art took many forms. It took, architecture in the form of that house, stonemasonry in the form of various kinds of sculpture in stone. It would involve painting, writing, of course, and many other different craftsy things that he did. And, at least many modern women understand that crafts are important. They may not understand why, but we have a Michael's here in Annapolis, and I think that it's a chain across the country. So you can go into a Michael's store and start and find any type of craft or art that you want. And people naturally have an urge to create. And so those stores stay in business. I visited ours yesterday with my wife. And so do any of you want to make a comment, any generalized comments about this essay before we begin to talk about it in detail? And I actually have it teed up so we can show it to the people that are following us here as we go, so they can actually read along with us.
I wanted to just mention his childhood was so difficult. He did not have parents that were nurturing, that he could trust and admire, and that left him with severe wounds. And I think that helps us understand at least the images that came up in his Red Book.
Well, that's mainly his mother was very untrustworthy. I think, he was pretty good with his father. And I'm just promoting Deborah to a panelist also. There we are. Okay. Hello, Deborah. Welcome. His father did nurture him in the sense of bringing along his classical education. Okay. And he must have helped him with Greek and Latin and that sort of thing. But his father was also rather aloof, I guess. And he died when Jung was quite young, and when he was 24. And so you know, if he was dealing with his childhood years, it was at a pretty rudimentary basis, on a pretty rudimentary basis. And his mother was, you know, had certain mental difficulties. I'm not sure how we could characterize them in today's, with today's knowledge. I mean, she had experiences of the objective psyche, and we just didn't understand them well enough back then. I mean, I was listening to a TED Talk today by a guy who has entitled his TED Talk "Psychotic Break or Spiritual Awakening," and basically saying that shamans are simply people that have had these visionary experiences, what I call religious experiences. And we know a lot more about those today, but, you know, 100 years ago and more, people would have thought that they were very weird, I guess. Um, and so now we can say, well, you know, a lot of people have that, and actually that's to be encouraged somewhat. So anyway, so does anybody want to make a generalized comment before I start talking about this? And we can talk about it as we go, and I'll try to follow the chat on the YouTube channel.
Well, I'll make a comment, Skip.
Yeah, go ahead.
Happy New Year, by the way.
Happy New Year,
everybody. Jung as a craftsman, I think, is very important here, and I think the article that you're about to read talks about what intuition is and how important intuition is, and how Jung had really struggled with intuition until he met you'll be reading about the woman.
Yeah.
And then on the other hand, he's saying you can use this by practicing a craft of some sort.
Right. And
this enables the intuition to come into existence or reality, in other words. And so,
right. And I'm gonna do a demonstration of that with the activity that I'm doing in the last 2-3 months tonight. But first of all, I want to address the article, and I think that by most people's lights, this actually is excellent artwork that he did. I mean, there are a lot of people that are around selling giclée prints of Jung's images and that sort of thing. And so those images do appear in people's homes today as artwork. And so anyway, just for the people that are on YouTube who are chatting, I'm not going to respond to just generic greetings and that sort of thing as we go. But when we get into substantive comments, I'll comment on that. But let's look at how this began. And I have varying opinions about this, but this article, and I can share the first page of it so that folks can read along with me as I read this. But I'm looking at this first quote from Dr. Jung. Has everybody seen that now? Okay. And so he says, when I was writing down these fantasies, I once asked myself, what am I really doing? Certainly this has nothing to do with science, but then what is it? Whereupon a voice within me said, it is art. I was astonished. It had never entered my head that what I was writing had any connection with art. Then I thought, perhaps my unconscious is forming a personality that is not me, but which is insisting on coming through to expression. mind you, the oak tree that's trying to put out a branch, let's say. I knew for a certainty that the voice had come from a woman. I recognized it as the voice of a patient, a talented psychopath who had a strong transference to me. She had become a living figure within my mind. Obviously, what I was doing wasn't science. What then could it be but art? I said very emphatically to this voice that my fantasies and had nothing to do with art, and I felt a greater inner resistance. No voice came through, however, and I kept on writing. Then came the next assault, and again the same assertion, that is art. This time I caught her and said, no, it is not art. On the contrary, it is nature. So she goes on to say, Linda Carter goes on to say, we now know from research of Sono Shamdasani that the woman in question in the above passage was Maria Moltzer, a Dutch woman trained as a nurse with whom Jung was involved at the time. Putting it as involved would be a euphemism, I think. There are various views about what the relationship with Maria Moltzer was, but I want to share with you an image of Maria Moltzer. It's a hidden image, but it is an image that appears in the hardbound copy of Man and His Symbol. So you have to have the hardbound copy to see this. And so in this image, now mind you, I suspect that there were quite a lot of competitions going on among the women in Dr. Jung's life, and he had a lot of them. They were referred to often as the Valkyries, and it was certainly 4 central women in his life, but many other women. And so this image is sort of a representation of that, because Marie-Louise von Franz was the one that was responsible for putting this book together. And so she damned with faint praise most of the women in this image by not identifying them in the picture. The only one that's identified, I guess, is Emma Jung, who's here. Are you seeing my cursor here?
Yes, yes.
Okay, all right. So this woman is Emma Jung. Here's Dr. Jung here. Here's Sigmund Freud. Now, Sigmund Freud was actually 5'7", and Dr. Jung was actually 6'2". So the way this picture was taken was Dr. Freud was stood up on a box, so he would look taller than Dr. Jung. And this is Sander Ferenczi here, but we're mainly interested for this moment. I once actually identified all of these women, but I've forgotten a couple of them. But I can say that Maria Moltzer is this woman, and she was a nun, among other things. That wasn't mentioned. She became an analyst, and in other places I've had speculation that she had become Dr. Jung's lover. Now, I don't know who this woman is, but this woman is Luz Salome, who was the lover of Nietzsche. And she was quite an outspoken woman. And there's a lot about her, but I'm not going to get into that. Then
It's interesting her name is Salome.
Yes, it really is. And then this woman is Beatrice Hinkle. And Beatrice Hinkle was, I think, the first woman to become like the public health administrator of the city of San Francisco. She was a medical doctor, and she was responsible for the original translation of Psychology of the Unconscious, which was the book that caused Jung and Freud to break. and she organized that to be published in English in 1915. But she was very active in early Jungian circles. Now, this is Emma Jung. This woman I do not know, but this woman is Toni Wolff. And Dr. Jung had a ongoing menage a trois going with Toni Wolff and Emma for basically both of the lifetime of both women. Um, I guess Toni died in 1953 and Emma in 1956, and he lived another 5 years after that. I do not know who this woman was, but those are some of the primary usual suspects. The woman who is not here, I thought she was in this picture at some point, but maybe I'm not sure, is Sabine Spielrein. And Sabine had basically broken off her relationship with Dr. Jung by this time, and her relationship is depicted in A Dangerous Method, the movie A Dangerous Method. And she then went up and worked with Freud after working with Jung for many years. So anyway, this is Maria Maltzer, and I suspect that this conversation was not only happening in his psyche, but was actually happening in real life, because Maria Maltzer, at the minimum, was an analysand of Dr. Jung's at the very minimum. Whatever else was going on. Not that I care, but just to spice up the evening a little bit, I thought I'd mention that. Okay. So what Jung was after, though, was he wanted to see what would come up from the unconscious. And Dr. Maltzer, I don't know if she was a doctor, but she certainly became a professional therapist. And she is credited in this essay and by a number of other people with the discussion of intuition and of adaptation to life via intuition. And so that comes up on the next page, page 234. And I guess I can share that too. Now you should be, are you able to see that? I presume. So, besides Jungian reductionism, because Jung was originally a reductionist, a logos-oriented guy, and he thought he was doing science. And what women are well known for being intuitive, and so it took a woman to come in and start talking about intuition as a way of adaptation to life. And so it goes on to say here on page 234, from her point of view, intuition is the oldest function and emerges out of instinct, allowing for adaptation to life through understanding. She even implies that intuition operates to link the conscious mind with the unconscious and possibly thinking and feeling through art, visions, and religious practices in a way that resonates with Jung's ideas about the transcendent function, also written about in 1916, but not published until 1958. One wonders with hindsight about the life influence between this doctor and a bright, highly intuitive patient whose ideas have been relegated to a mere mention in the history of analytical psychology. Parallels can be found in the minimization of Spielrein's influence on Freud's concept of the death instinct. And so it's very common to find women analysts, women Jungian analysts, who are objecting to the fact that men were taking all the credit. And of course, that was the way in every field up until quite recently. And the recent movie Aeronauts shows an example of that, where the two people, man and woman, go up in a balloon in about 1862, and the woman is the pilot and flies the balloon to 36,000 feet, which I think is an unbelievable height to go without oxygen. But nonetheless, the man took the credit in the scientific community. And so that was happening a lot up until very recently. And hopefully we're getting beyond that. But do you want to say something more about the intuition then, Jerome, or anyone else?
Well, I think when he's talking about, he really kind of discovered the intuition as being the driving force that comes from an instinct. And in one letter that he wrote to someone, he said that a true artist, like your true artist type, they come from their instincts through the intuition, and it's all together. And people that aren't true artists, in other words, they're blocked from that. And I think what we're talking about here is try to get that unblocked in people that are not true artists, that are just coming from that domain, so to speak.
Right.
I'll share a little bit about this.
Go ahead.
So first of all, I'll just explain why I have this paint or ochre on my face. And it's somewhat, I would say it is my intuition that brought me to have this paint on my face. I just a couple of hours ago was part of a pipe ceremony, and it was led by an Indigenous elder. I'm in Alberta, Canada, and I had the pleasure of having this paint applied to me by elder and former chief of the Piikani Nation in southern Alberta, which extends actually into Montana. What we built is the border that divides those people. And here's a picture of Reg Crowshoe in his ceremonial outfit. And in fact, this is the pipe I just smoked. And the ceremony, this pipe ceremony, was to induct me as a worker to an Indigenous gathering place society, which is an initiative to create a cultural center for Indigenous people here in Mohkinstsis, as it's known, or city of Calgary. And the reason I'm pursuing this is for 5 years now, I've been struggling with my personal concern of the planet and my future for my children. And probably about 5 years ago, I read this, and I got to quoted it here. Einstein in the New York Times, May 25th, 1946, said, "A new type of thinking is essential if mankind is to survive and move toward higher levels." So I thought back then, well, what kind of other thinking is there? And coincidentally, the plight of the Indigenous people at the same time was coming onto my radar. So that's where I guess my intuition has led me to this point and to carry forward with exploring with the Blackfoot Confederacy, which they have, for example, a decision-making circle is facilitated by a pipe ceremony. A community member who requires a decision be made gives tobacco to the Thunder Medicine Pipe bundle keepers. These bundle keepers are two individuals who have transferred the right to guide the process. So now a little bit about me. I'm not artistic. However, just the other day, thank you, Nancy. We exchanged some emails, and she thought that something that I wrote was particularly striking. And I thought, well, maybe I'm not an artistic person, but maybe I'll grab onto that as a piece of art from me, and I'll just read it, and then that'll be enough for me. But what I wrote was to Nancy, I said, I think I am close to moving into a more active, transformative phase, which may be akin to getting my head cut off and going out into the community more heart-centered. And the reference to getting my head cut off, Skip, was from previous session.
Right. Okay, well, Miles, that's an interesting point. But of course, the key here is that we do have to get out and be prepared to take risks. That's what growing up is about, actually. But it's also what individuation is about, because you can't sit at home and stare at the television set and live a life. And so we have all these nihilist young people running around today who don't know what to do. And I think part of that maybe relate to poor fathering, that about half of them don't have a father in the home. And this is, in my belief, why Jordan Peterson became so popular, because he sort of became a father to people. But his point was, and which I agree with, is that, you know, if you want to learn about life, you have to get yourself a life first. You have to get pulled into life. And Dr. Jung talks about the anima as sort of an invitation into life. Let's say that you know, boy meets girl, boy gets girl pregnant, boy marries girl, they have children, and all of a sudden you're in the problem of life. And what we have to realize is that when we're young people, let's say under 21, we are just learning how to be human beings. And somehow we get the idea in high school, maybe, that, boy, if we just finished our high school diploma, we'll have it made then. And of course, that's not true, because basically in high school, you're just learning how to be a human being. And in college, maybe you're learning either a trade, a profession, or a broadening of your knowledge, but you still haven't gotten into life. And so, you know, I loved going to college myself, and I kept doing it until I was 30 years old, 32 years old, I guess, 30 years old at least. And so I have 12 years of college in my personal history. Plus I've taught for 7 years at the college level. And it's a way to avoid life, but it isn't life. That you have to go out and start doing things. And the reason it's there is to learn how, you know, we're problem solvers. As creatures, we're problem solvers. And so when you're being educated, you're learning how to solve problems and having the experience of interacting with people and all those things that you need to do in order to live an adult life. But it doesn't mean that when you get a diploma or a degree that everything's going to be hunky-dory. We have problems every day, all day. And we're constantly solving problems. And, you know, my wife stubbed her toe last night. In fact, I stubbed mine twice last night, but she stubbed her toe and got a bruise on her toe last night. So just before I came on here, we're trying to problem solve what to do about her bruised toe. And so we're toward the end of our lives, and we still have these fundamental problems coming up. So we have to learn that. But in terms of art, now there is a question on the chat here that I want to respond to, and maybe this can help you, help everyone. It's from Matt D. He says, "Hey Skip, I'm taking an educational art class in college right now, and I'm thinking of doing a project on active imagination and painting in order to understand the unconscious. Where should I start?" Okay. First of all, I think that a very interesting point about this particular article is that Linda Carter indicates that active imagination is not only what Dr. Jung did during the period 1913 to 1919, let's say. It is all kinds of arts, all kinds of expression, all kinds of creativity. All of that is active imagination, whether it's dance or what have you. I mean, Joseph Campbell's wife was a fine dancer and did a lot with dance over her lifetime. I don't remember her name clearly at the moment, but
it can also be what Miles is doing is he's writing, and writing
precisely.
is art. And you got prose, poetry. I mean, you're telling stories in an art form. I mean, it's beautiful.
Right. And the fact that Miles has war paint on his face right now.
He's a warrior.
Yeah. I mean, he's learning experientially what these things are about. But in terms of an answer for Matt D, here's what I suggest you do. Go to Michael's in your area or any art store. And it doesn't have to be an art store. It can be a cooking supply store. It can be sort of any sort of craft store. It can be the Sears tool department. But walk through that place and see what speaks to you. Okay. Now I can go in, it makes me crazy because I go into Michael's, and because I'm so intuitive, I want to try everything, but I know I can't. And so, but see what it is that speaks to you. If you go to an art store and nothing speaks to you, then go to a kitchen supply store, and then go to a Sears tool department and find whatever craft speaks to you. And then, you could also go to a quarry. Dr. Jung did that, right? And that got him going on his house that he built at Bollingen. And so whatever it is that speaks to you, pick that thing up and try it. And so if you do that, then you're going to have, you're going to start to have things happen. Now, it doesn't mean that, if you start painting and you find out, well, I really don't like painting, but I really like to try sculpture. Actually, I wanted to do sculpture first, but when I started to do sculpture, I found that the terracotta material was drying out my hands unmercifully, and I simply couldn't do sculpture. I mean, I did a few small sculptures and enjoyed it, but it was ripping my hands apart. And so then I decided to get into the visual arts, and then I moved away from it. And so even the development of this Jung reading group 4 years ago is a kind of creativity that I'm communicating with my unconscious. So I do on this channel what my unconscious tells me to do at any given moment. So this morning I read BTS is coming out with a new album about the shadow. And so this morning I read an excerpt from the Red Book for BTS, where Dr. Jung directly addresses issues about the shadow for them. But, that's what my unconscious said was most important for today, even though that's not the part I wanted to read today.
But you're coming from intuition. Is what's guiding you. In other
Precisely,
words,
surely.
your driver is intuition at this point, and that's
Right,
how you've adapted to see things, and that's how you trust that. I
right.
trust mine. In other words,
But I think everybody has intuition. They may not have exercised it much, but I think everybody would, in the right commercial environment, whether it's the cooking supply store where you're motivated to start cooking a certain dish. One of the things I do for my creativity is make an omelet for my wife every morning. And so in cooking supply stores, you might find an omelet maker type thing. And you never know what it is, but then give it a try and find out what speaks to you. So what has spoken to me over many years with Dr. Jung's work is the calligraphy that he did in the Red Book. And Jerome and I have been looking at the possibility of buying a new Red Book. What the Red Book was for Dr. Jung was basically a very sophisticated scrapbook. And they're not cheap, but if you were to purchase one of these today, it would be about $1,000 to buy a book like this, which is quite thick. But it basically looks like the Red Book that Dr. Jung actually used, and it has fine paper in it and that sort of thing. And it's a handmade book. But in order then to get a blank book like that you've spent $1,000 for, and to make it meaningful, you want to learn how to do calligraphy. So I started to look at calligraphy earlier in the fall just to see if I could do it. And I didn't, at first it was very difficult, but I bought a couple books on calligraphy and I started to do it. And the latest project that I had success with, I'll just show it to you here. And so I'm now 3 months into my calligraphy. And so the latest one, this is a Buddhist prayer that my wife, who is a Buddhist teacher, asked me to do in calligraphy. So this is in effect, it's a prayer of grace to use before eating. And so I'm using a style of calligraphy here called chancery. And it's a little easier than the Gothic print I was doing before. And a lot of people think this is quite beautiful, the way these letters look on the page.
It's kind of wavy looking and kind of, I like it. So
right. Well,
I haven't gotten as advanced as you are because I haven't had a chance to practice too much. But
right.
But I did learn in Michael's you can go to the scrapbook section.
Right.
And they sell the glue that's non-acid. So if you have to glue something to it, you can mount it. So if you wanted to mount that in your Red Book, you could do that and find the glue there. So
So then I want to show you how this develops, because we could all be self-help in terms of our art, but I have to figure out where I put this on my desktop now. Where did I put it? Hold on a second, because I wanted to start to do something that was a little bit more embellished. Somehow I seem to have outdone myself here. Wait a minute. It's in here, I think. Okay. I've been taking some of Jung's quotes, and I started with this one, and which is, "My friends, it is wise." Okay, wait a minute. Let me share this with you because it's a series of 6 images just to show you my development, Matt. And so you have to be willing to be stupid at the beginning, all right? And so I want to show you the process. This is not finished by any means, but it's my process for what I'm trying to do with my calligraphy. And what I found was that when I'm doing calligraphy, it's basically a form of meditation for me. So it's a way for me to connect with my unconscious. So here's my first attempt. And what I wanted to do was to do calligraphy of this quote from Dr. Jung: "My friends, it is wise to nourish the soul," which is what you're doing when you're doing any artwork. Otherwise, you will breed dragons and devils in your heart. And so I had in mind putting dragons around the actual words dragons and devils. And I'm trying to think of other things that I can use around the heart and that sort of thing. But this was probably the very first attempt that I did maybe 3-4 weeks ago. And then I found a video on YouTube of teaching a 3-year-old child how to draw a dragon. And so I actually wrote down the process of drawing the dragon. And so here's the dragon that emerged from that process. It was only a 10-minute video. But then I have a couple of books that have dragons in them. And so I got the D for dragon here, and I started to make a dragon, and I'm breeding dragons. So this line in the D is actually a baby dragon, right? And so you see some very rudimentary attempts to do dragons here. And then here's a very rudimentary devil that I was trying to figure out what a devil looks like. So this was...
Yeah, and those are excellent. And it shows us that all you need is a pen.
Well, all you need is a pen and paper and a YouTube thing and a simple book, right? Maybe a simple book. And, you know, there's a few books on calligraphy out there. And so you can learn basic calligraphy from those. But okay, so now I got a little bit more complex here, where you see I've got the D with a dragon, but I still don't have the flame very well. I still don't have the wings very well. And this is another Jungian quote: "Often the hands know to solve a riddle with which the intellect has wrestled in vain." And so here you still see this is a rather stupid devil on my, and I'm just doodling around and just committing myself to get it done, and to keep doing it until I get to something that I like. So then I was trying to figure out, well, okay, what does a dragon and a devil look like? So the dragon on the left side here, again, you see more or less the same one that I had before, except this one looks like an angry dog, I guess. But I started to get the devil, and I was having trouble with the wings, and the horns, and this is by no means a finished product yet, but I'm just trying to learn, you know, what's in a devil. Well, I noticed that this nasty nose and this eye, where across the top it's flat, but it goes down, and often the eye is black, the eyeball itself is black, or in this case it's white. That looks quite nasty. But I still didn't have the wings. And so then here's another attempt at the devil and putting the devil around the word devils. And still it's not what I want, but you can see that my devil is getting nastier than the first one that I had. And then finally, I think this is the last one. And here I'm getting a little bit better with the dragon. I've gotten a fairly decent wing here. And I've managed to get some horns and the tongue of flame and so on. And so you just have to say, okay, I know I'm no good right now, so now I'm going to start and see what happens. And you have to remember what Malcolm Gladwell said, that, you know, if you want to be able to do anything, you have to be willing to put 10,000 hours into it. And, you know, his point is that very successful people in any field put 10,000 hours in. And so what is it like? Well, it's like Zen. So when I'm giving a talk here, I'm in my zone. So I never remember after one of these sessions what I've said. I have no idea what I've said because I've learned how to get my ego out of the way and just go for it. And so I think of myself as speaking from myself during these sessions. And it's something that I've just learned to trust intuitively. But we all have done this. So let me give you a couple of examples. One is typing and touch typing. Almost all of us today using computers have learned to touch type. So we know where the keys are. And we don't have to think about where to put our fingers. And so as long as you have to think about where the letters are on your keyboard, you can't type. It's only when you get enough familiarity with it that you can forget the keys and forget even thinking about the keyboard, then you can type. And so the same is true of riding a bicycle. As long as you have to think about pedaling and braking and steering and balance, you can't ride your bicycle. But once you forget those things, once you can forget them and just do them, then you're in the zone of riding a bicycle. And so all creative activities work this way. Another example is, you know, a jazz flugelhorn player or saxophone player or whatever who spends many hours learning notes and where they are and what they sound like, but it's only when they can forget how to play and just play from their emotion, then they're communicating with their self and they're achieving this transcendent function of coming across from the unconscious into the conscious and dealing with that. And when you do that, then you're conscious of it, and then you're not breeding dragons and devils in your soul. Then when the devils and dragons come up, you can deal with them in some way.
Hey, Skip, can I share
sure.
an image?
Yeah, sure.
Okay. Does everybody see that?
Yes. Mm-hmm.
I can't see it. That's Dr. Jung's, when he wrote these 7 sermons to the dead.
Oh, yes. Uh-huh.
This is
Sermon 4.
It was private. Mm-hmm. And he had this is how precise he was. If you look at the lineup and you look at the, you know, all
that's handwritten, Jerome? Yep. That's done by hand? Wow.
That's Dr. Jung's, did that by hand. Now, he had it printed, copies of it, but this was his original work for the 7 Sermons of the Dead, which was printed back in, what, 1919, something like that, Skip? I can't remember.
I think even earlier, maybe 1916.
Yeah, 16 or 17. And
right.
This was a private copy that he sent out in a book to different people that he thought were along the way of the individuation route and understood what he was saying. And even at that time, you can see how precise and everything's lined up. And it's a craft.
I suspect that this is from the printed book, Jerome. But nonetheless, his actual calligraphy is very near to this. If not,
it is his. Yeah.
You're sure it is his?
Yeah.
I don't know the origin of this particular document, but anyway, the point is that we're talking about the transcendent function, okay, which is to develop the ability to communicate between your unconscious mind and your conscious mind, because your unconscious mind is going to drive your life. And if you can hear your unconscious mind, you're going to be advantaged. But as I was hearing this talk about shamans today, and the guy was saying, well, people started to talk about hearing voices, and then if you were hearing voices 100 years ago, like Jung's mother was, then you were considered crazy. But actually, that is the way our unconscious communicates with us. And Dr. Jung, the imagery which he has in the Red Book is saying, this is the stuff in our unconscious. This is how our unconscious communicates with us, by having our complexes appear to us as an actual person, okay, which is what he was saying in the Red Book through his active imagination, but which happens in all of us. And as I have said many times, the same thing happened to me spontaneously when I wrote my novel, where obviously things that had been going on and churning in my unconscious for 35 years suddenly started to come up, and they came up as images of individual people and actual theater scenes in effect. And so let's see, I don't know, Jerome, I wonder if you can, or if I can get rid of that. Okay. Okay, so I don't know if others have the panel just covering the entire screen, but I did. And so the way to get rid of that is to hit the escape button.
Yeah, escape key.
Yeah, and I wasn't sure whether that was coming through.
No, I'd stop the share. So
right, but sometimes when you do that, it doesn't.
There are some questions on here about the difference between instinct and intuition. And
okay, you want to address those, because I've been yakking. So go ahead.
Related. Well, I'll give it a try. But anyway, the one of the things you could think about is we all, anytime we see something or have a reaction, there is an intuition flash, they call it. Mm-hmm. And a lot of people just ignore that. And it becomes a habit, and they don't, because if you stop for a minute, it's almost instantaneous. The instinct kicks in and wants to communicate something.
Surely.
But we ignore those things. And
well,
I always think about a case when I was driving down, and I said, okay, I want to take a short route to go to Best Buy to buy something. And my intuition said, no, don't do that. But I did it anyway, and ended up in a traffic jam for 2 hours trying to save 5 minutes. And I could have gone just the long way around and been there and been done,
Right.
But these are these little intuition things you get, and if you ignore them, or you go with them. So, but for some reason there's all sorts of cases and examples of people hearing these intuitions that come through, the ones that listen to them.
Well, I think,
and they're aware of them.
And Dr. Jung pointed out the 2 million year old man that he called it that, but now we know it's the 3.5 billion year old man.
Yeah, kind of old. Yeah.
Right. But the point is, there's a part of our psyche that's kept our ancestors alive and reproducing since single-celled organisms. So we all have an ancestry, ancestry.com. Well, that's not even scratching the surface, because you actually have parents that go back to single-celled organisms, or even maybe before that. And so throughout that whole 3.5 billion years, what has evolved that now is in us, and we are the carriers of this life now, is the ability to do two things: stay alive and reproduce. Okay, that's the function that our instinct has always done for us. Now, the way that started to communicate with us was through imagery. And so yesterday I was at one of these ACT events, a community of transformation events, and a very interesting question was asked, which is, what is the earliest thing that you can remember, and how long ago was it? And I remembered something that I've said a few times in this group, which is that I can remember something from at least 140 million years ago. Or I did remember something from 140 million years ago, because our psyche works with images. And when I was 6 years old, I saw an early Jurassic Park movie that had a black and white Tyrannosaurus Rex in it. But that night, or within a week or so of that, seeing that movie, which constellated dragons in my psyche, I had a dream about this kind of dinosaur that has a very long neck, and it reaches up to the top of trees and eats off the top of trees. And my dream was that I could see out the window, and I could see this creature up above my house eating in the trees. And it scared the tar out of me. I'm sure I was crying when I spoke to my mother about it. And she assured me that those creatures were all dead now. But my point is that I didn't have that image before, because in 1952, it wasn't very common for kids to see images of dragons. Or not dragons, but of dinosaurs. And I had never seen an image of a dinosaur at that point in my life, never. And so that image had to come through my psyche. And so that did pass somehow through my DNA back from a time when our ancestors, who were other kinds of creatures, actually saw dinosaurs like that, images of dinosaurs like that. It must have scared the tar out of them. And so that imprinted in the psyche of the species. And so now it makes complete sense to me that we have all these children's toys of dinosaurs, because it teaches kids not to be afraid of dinosaurs, because they may well have a dream about a dinosaur. And you can imagine that the dragon of St. George, probably they found bones of dinosaurs in Europe that were very terrifying. I mean, they found actual bones, and they said, wow, these dragons actually exist. But at the time those myths came up, they didn't know that those bones were millions of years old, presumably. So they didn't know that they weren't existing in medieval Europe.
That one doesn't look too terrifying, though.
No, this one doesn't look too terrifying, and maybe that's the point, isn't it? That we have these images in our psyche, and this makes them not scary. Because
this one was spotted in Calgary.
Uh-huh.
You might have actually seen this as a kid, because it's been in the Calgary Zoo since the 50s.
Right, but the dragon, or the dinosaur that I had the image of in my dream, had a neck that was twice that long. Okay. And there wasn't an image of it in the movie that I saw. So it was an early precursor to Jurassic Park that I'd seen with my parents, an old black and white movie. But, you know, so that psyche, that instinct to be afraid of that has been, you know, was there for millions of years, literally millions of years. And so those are fundamental instincts, but you want to be in touch with those instincts. And so I've been doing a lot of talking.
Well, they've also proven that we have imprints for snakes, the fear of snakes. Because, and I'm sure anybody that's been scared by a snake will jump. I'll jump. You know, I like snakes. I don't mind snakes. But if I get surprised by one, my immediate reaction, it's an imprint that's imprinted in your brain. And we've got all sorts of the imprints, and that's what you're talking about, is we have those imprints, and we need to become aware of them.
Now, here's a creative activity on our chat. Natsko said, I even like writing intimate letters anonymously and leaving them all over town.
That's creative.
And that's creative. I mean, that, you know, that's that would be a creative thing, to just start dropping off these anonymous letters in people's boxes. Oh my God. Terrific idea.
I wanted to just mention about intuition, that the body helps us with that as well. And if we're not just sure about making a choice, one of the things we can notice is if there's a sense of expansion in our body or a contraction. Are we drawn to it, or are we not? And that really can be trusted.
Yeah. So Matt D wanted me to recommend literary sources about active imagination and understanding its connection through art. Matt, I hope that you're on our general Dropbox. We have a general Dropbox for this group, and in there, if you cannot afford the folio version of the Red Book, which you see behind me here, it's quite a large volume, costs about $150 from Amazon. But if you go into the Dropbox, you'll find a subfolder called Collected Works, and there you can find an electronic copy of the Red Book. And I'd urge you to take a look at that as an example, because the Red Book is nothing but active imagination. That's what it is. So that's my recommendation.
I'd like to recommend Inner Work by Robert A. Johnson.
Yes.
Yeah, that's a good one.
Can you elaborate a little more, Nancy, about what you said about the body reacting to? Is that to the art you create, or are you talking about when you're looking at someone else's art? Or you said contraction or expansion from the body?
It takes intention to notice what's happening in your body, and whether you're tightening up or you're relaxing. That's another way to look at it. And if you're tensing up, that's a direction not to go. And if you're relaxing, then that is a direction to go. And so if you're in touch with your feelings in your body through the day, or you just check in periodically, or at least before you make decisions, you'll get to know that fairly clearly.
Well, I think that's important, because a lot of people are cut off from their body and they don't recognize these things. And part of even active imagination, you're trying to get yourself back from your thinking space and everything down to a calm space. And you can become aware of those things. Otherwise, you're just going on, you're not aware. It's just like I said, we're not aware of some of the intuition flashes that we get. We don't pay attention to them. So this is kind of draw yourself back into a quiet space, and then have whatever comes up, comes up. So.
Right. Now,
A simple way to practice that, Miles, is let's say you have two choices to do something in your office or to go to the grocery store. And it's a 50-50 choice for you to notice in your body what you're feeling when you think about going to the grocery store and what you think about feeling when you think about going to your office or your den. And just follow that openness, follow that sense of expansion.
Yeah, and Penelope on the chat says she gets it because she thinks about the fight, flight, freeze thing and who to stay away from. So
Fight or flight. Fight or flight. Fight or flight.
Fight, flight, or freeze.
Fight or
Right.
flight or fight or
freeze. You know, you freeze. Like.
Okay.
Okay. Montana Hoveder says there's something strange that has been happening with me. If I sleep for a long time and then go right back to sleep, I wake up and without conscious will, elaborate fantasies continue in the form. And so I want to recommend that you look at a video called Skip's Dream in the Sheriff's Office, which is on this channel. And I'm going to give you on the chat a link to it. And that was a case where I had a dream. I was having a dream, and I continued it as active imagination. And you can find it at that link. And that would be an example of it. But it's what I did in that case was I had the dream, and then I wanted to find out what happened at the end of the dream. So I went back and I put myself back in a sort of a trance state and tried to put myself back into the dream space, and it worked. And as a result, the dream continued on, but I was conscious and I was able then to write it down. And so that would be an act of imagination in that form.
That's kind of like what they call lucid dreaming too.
Yes, although in lucid dreaming, you are able to control the action. I was not able to control the action in that case.
Oh, you couldn't jump in?
Well, I was in it, but I didn't have the presence of mind to talk with any of the players. I was just participating, and it was happening to me, and so on. Now, R on the chat says, how is intuition different from instinct? Do any of you want to address that before I do? Well, okay, I'll speak to this then. Intuition is the way the psyche works. Instinct is the way the body works, I think, is the way to put it. And so instinct is something where somebody throws a ball at your face and you go like that to protect your face. That's an instinct. There's nothing intuitive about that. That's just a reflex. But intuition is seeing how various things connect up in the world. I guess is the way I would refer to it.
I would kind of just add to that is the instinct can cause you to have the intuition in terms of to see the relationship. In other words, the instinct is a call. You know? And while some instincts are like what you said, they're just bodily things, catch a ball or something like that. But they can also relate to, as you say, seeing the overall picture of the things coming in.
Right. Now, Will of Earth says, creativity comes from a positive mind. Negativity negates creativeness. And I don't know if you'd agree with that, Jerome, but I would in general. And
Not sure. If you are, like, let's say you had a bad dream
Yes.
or you're carrying a feeling of great sorrow and you don't know what it's all about. And if you put that down, express that in some way, a dance, a painting, however you're inclined, that can be a healing act.
Right. I agree with that. But that's actually a creative act, isn't it, too? Because you're actually creating something. Even though it's in a negative context, it's actually creating something.
Well, you're coming from a negative space and trying to figure out what that is. You can also come from a positive space and do that. And I don't know. I don't understand, I guess, the negative and positive.
Well, I think all right, let's say that I have this little fetish right now about dragons and devils because I'm trying to do my calligraphy thing. And, what I find is, okay, these are very negative creatures, and I find a certain fascination in trying to draw them. And obviously I was doing it in a very rudimentary way at first, but gradually I'm getting better at it. And obviously there are all these people in the fantasy art world, the manga world, and so on, who really get into doing all that stuff. But at the same time, then when you do that, you bring it into consciousness. And so negativity, in the sense that Will of Earth is talking about, is negativity which says, it is like Eeyore in Winnie the Pooh, nothing happening, nothing good. I'm not going to go do anything. I think I'll just go over, sit in the corner and die type thing. Well, okay.
So it's kind of like the motivation of not to do something. And then like Penelope just said, I do that with my pain. Great poetry flows when I least expect it. But that means she's willing to get it out,
Right. Now, Flea says instinct is mostly geared toward survival, if I'm not mistaken. Intuition, in my opinion, is knowing things you couldn't otherwise know without some type of awakening, so to speak. Yeah, I think that's true. And one of the reasons that I have such a developed intuition is I've had to live so many lives because I was raised in a military household. So every year or two, my whole world was changing. And so I've had so many different experiences in my lifetimes. People ask me, if I've lived 9 lives. In a way I have. Let's see. Chris says, as a violinist, your story of Jascha Heifetz's student was numinous to me also. What would you say are ways to develop the inner fire Heifetz talks about? Well, if you're meant to have that inner fire, you won't be able to stop it. It's not a question of developing it. If you see the movie Frida, about Frida Kahlo, and in that movie, Melina, who plays her husband, says to her, he says, if you're going to do art, you won't be able to stop doing art. You want to be an artist. If you're going to be an artist, you won't be able to stop it. And so just do it, And so the point is, I don't know whether you're meant to be a violinist or not. If you're meant to be a violinist, then yourself is going to keep pushing you on. You're going to have failure. This is where the Job archetype comes in, because even the greatest violinist, fails sometimes one way or another. And so when you have those failures, the idea is you lament about it and then you're reborn into the next step. So if you saw my drawings earlier on in this conversation, if I was put off by how crummy my first dragon was, then, you know, I'm never going to be able to draw a dragon. I mean, you know, if I just show you this picture again, this one, where if I looked at that and said, well, that's an awful dragon I drew, I guess you know, I should go out and eat dirt or something, because I'm never going to be able to draw a dragon. Then that would have been the end of it, right? But instead, I feel a call, a push coming through from my unconscious to try to be able to do this calligraphy that includes imagery, okay? And so every time I fail so far, I keep going. I try to look for another source of how to do the drawing and how to do it better. If you're a violinist that has that call, that has that fire, you're going to say, okay, maestro, I know I didn't have the fire in that piece, but I'm going to do better. And you just push through and say, this is for me. That's yourself telling you that you're supposed to be a violinist. But, you know, this guy, Heifetz's answer was the correct answer. And because the guy went away and didn't become a concert violinist, which probably means that he never would have, okay, because he didn't have the fire to push through to get that extra something that would make him a concert violinist. That was the point. And so at the end of that story, Heifetz says, I must have been right, because if you had had the fire, you would have paid no attention to me, right? And so maybe I should, for the benefit of new people here, maybe I should quickly tell this story. So the story is that Jascha Heifetz, who was a leading violinist of the 20th century, had students, and one of the students came to Heifetz and said, his father had died and his family wants him to give up the violin and come run the family business. And he wants to try to make a decision. And he says, I want to decide whether I'm going to have what it takes to be a concert violinist. And so I want to play for you and you tell me what the answer is. And Heifetz's answer at the end of the playing is, you don't have the fire. And that's what a teacher should always tell you, because if you don't have the fire, you should go on to something that you are going to be good at. But if you do have the fire, then you're going to pay no attention. And so when the student comes back 20 years later and says to Heifetz that he's gone into the business and hasn't been a concert pianist or violinist, and Heifetz said, why did you give up the violin? You played so beautifully. You were wonderful. The best student I ever had, type things. And the guy says, but maestro, you told me I didn't have the fire. And maestro says, I must have been right, because if you had had the fire, you would have paid no attention to me. And so, you know, I can show my drawings here to you, and you can say, Skip, your drawings on your calligraphy are baloney. Stop doing it. You're wasting your time. But for the time being, at least, I have the fire to push through on that, right? And so if the question is not ways to develop that inner fire, the question is ways to recognize whether you have it or not, and whether you should commit your life to that. I think that would be a way of saying it. Any comments on that? Nancy or Deborah? Sandy, anybody?
Well, I think for me, having an experience of God at, about 27 years old that was very numinous, started me down a particular path, and I could no more stop going down this path than anything. It
Mhm.
just is a fire within me. It is my life.
Right.
Well, I knew at a very early age that um, I was going to be a writer. I do a lot of other things too,
Right.
but I knew I was going to be a writer because I was writing poetry, and my mother even said, and I do remember this a little bit because my memories go back to beyond the age of 2, that I would sing in baby talk and it would all rhyme. And but then there also was an experience at 3 years old where and I do remember this, being set down on a neighbor's piano bench and being shown middle C, and she struck middle C on the piano. And now here I am, 66 and a half years later, that note of middle C is still in this head. When I
Mhm.
want to sing a song, I draw up that note. And if I want to sing it in the key of A, I count up 6 steps and I sing the Lord's Prayer in A. And so that never went away. It embedded itself in me. My brother at one point, who has a music degree, said, well, Deb, you have perfect pitch. I said, no, I don't think so, because I don't just grab notes out of the air. I have to go to my note that I always have and count up and down to what key I want to be in. But I knew I was going to be a writer because of, well, my first poem that I wrote is still published today. I was 9 years old.
Mhm.
So I guess I found my fire early, but then I kept, like Skip, which is why I relate to Skip so much, I guess. I kept trying other things, including art. And my mother is an incredible established artist.
Mhm.
And art, in drawing art, is my least, very least. My mother actually felt sorry for me and gave me art lessons, but it's a relaxation thing. So that I knew it was a relaxation thing.
Right.
But I knew, and I also knew from an early age, like Skip, that I didn't know what to call it. I will now call it intuitive. But I was having dreams of, I knew things were going to happen in our household hours before they would happen, minutes before they would happen, weeks before they would happen, as a toddler. So,
Right.
like Skip, like your dream. So it's, you've got to find it, and the only way you can find it is, I really agree with your story with the guy who said, if you don't have the fire to pursue it, then you really don't have the fire. If you're
Yeah,
gonna
you need to take up another line of work, really.
you have to fight to, and to make it worthwhile. Do you guys
Right.
agree with that? That if you're
Yeah,
not
and
willing to fight for it, you don't have the fire.
right. And my friend Bill, who's in our local group, usually wasn't here last week, but he usually comes. He was a art teacher and a IT teacher, and he said anytime any student came to him with a statement like that, he'd say, this work is no good. Even if he thought it was good, because it was a way of pushing the students to resist. Now, there have been a couple of comments here about I talked about the 10,000 hours of experience, and it came from a book, correctly noted here, that Malcolm Gladwell wrote, called Outliers. And so I urge you to take a look at Outliers if you if you want to succeed in anything. Go to Outliers and start working with that. And eventually you crash through, and
Well, Skip, it takes work, and we don't.
Sure.
A lot of times we only see the results of a famous group after they've done all the work, and they spent years and years,
Oh yeah, BTS is a
10,000
perfect
hours developing these skills.
yeah,
And,
that BTS is a great example of that, in fact.
oh yeah, I mean, they have worked and worked since children. I mean, they were actually children when they first started. And even
Definitely.
though they were talented, they had to go through and practice.
Right. And you know, I started a business here in Annapolis in the year 1990, after I broke my leg and was no longer in the Marines, and I failed 3 times, but 15 years later, after failing 3 times, and I'm talking about serious crash failure, uh, crash boom bah failure, 3 times in 2005, we took it public. So it's, you know, if you're, sometimes it's necessity. For me, it's necessity because I haven't been able to find a job since I was 39. And since then I've had to build my own job, and I do that I've done that out of necessity. But you know, it can also be out of joy and drive as well. And so anyway, lots of things are like that. Okay, go ahead. I'm gonna look for some other comments that I need to respond to.
I like Deborah's comment. Thanks, Deborah. The finding the passion is probably the clue here. And a lot of young people just, for some reason, can't find that passion, and they go down into that slump. And you know, this is becoming a big problem. Is that we're
Well,
not able to get them out of that slump or point them in the right direction. And
there's a lot of depression among children. I worked with children, hypnotherapy and psychology, and there is, and I did a lot of that 20, 30 years ago. But now I'm seeing, I mean, we're seeing autism and Asperger's. We're seeing these things multiply and multiply. We're seeing Down syndrome more and more often. And we're seeing a lot more. We're in a very fast-paced world,
Right.
and you know, teen and even children's suicide is astronomical. And so the rapid pace of the world, I think, the rapid pace of the world puts so much pressure on the young psyche that it can get to be too much. And instead
Well,
of
we haven't educated parents very well in terms of how to address that.
No, exactly.
yeah, I agree with that completely.
I worked with.
I don't think as a species we were designed to have that much stuff come on us at one time.
Exactly. I mean, if you look at, I'm very much a history buff. If you look back in history, what used to take hundreds and hundreds of years is now happening in months.
Oh yeah.
You know,
incredible.
I've seen some of the statistics where if you look at the past 100 years, the developments that have been made, it's like something like not 1,000%, but 10,000% over what it was, you know.
Sure.
Even just a few hundred years ago.
Yeah, even 100 years ago. My grandfather was born at a time when there were no automobiles, and my grandmother too. And
now look.
Yeah, so Nats goes to ask a question of Nancy. So this is for you, Nancy. Nancy, would you say that your expansion and contraction would be an example of introverted sensation or introverted intuition?
You know, I think Jerome could probably answer that better. One thing I did want to add to what I said before is it is a different place in the body than in the mind. If you're noticing expansion and contraction, relaxation, or feeling stress, if you're thinking about it, you're not in the right place. It's lower.
Well, I would say it's a sensation, because that's sensation is what it means. You're sensing and feeling that from a body standpoint.
That was like the guy Miles. He laughed about. I really loved his symbolism of. He said he had to cut his head off to get to his heart.
That's it.
You
Yeah.
have to get out of your head, which is what Skip followed up with. You've got to get out of your head and into your sensual, which is what you're saying, into your body, to get away from ego, to get away from to reach the level. I know exactly what you're saying. If you're inside your head, that's not going to give you an intuitive feeling.
Yeah, it's a visceral feeling, is what you would say. So
Really
I hope Miles didn't take it.
The way
I hope Miles didn't take us literally. So
No, I'm still here. I'm just making popcorn and burning it.
Okay. Oh, well, I'm glad. Okay. But I just thought the way you said that was so perfect. We have to cut our head off. We have to shut our brain off in order to reach our heart, our senses, all of our senses, including our sixth senses. And I will say our sixth sense and beyond, because I think there's more than six too.
So ours has an interesting comment here. He says, sorry, I'm new here and I am a stay-at-home dad with twins. The little one has CP. I don't know what CP is. And I had to...
Palsy?
What is it? Oh, maybe
cerebral palsy?
Yeah, okay. The little one has cerebral palsy, maybe. And I had to give my career up to be with her more. They are 3 now. Tried to get a copy of the Red Book for Christmas and got some books about it instead. So I ended up on this channel. Love the videos and the motivation, and have been watching your Ion reading because of what you said about it at the end of your intro to the Red Book. Okay, well, thank you, Aram. I appreciate the observation. You know, is this helpful for raising twins, especially someone with cerebral palsy? You know, it's not a how-to book, or it's not a how-to place actually for that, but it is a place where with what you face in your life, you can find a way to cope with your own feelings, I would think, about being in that situation. And certainly I have been through many dark nights of the soul. I mean, if we're into how many lives you've lived, and my 9 or so, I don't know if it's 9, but anyway, I've had a few dark nights of the soul, and so it's easy enough to go through those things. And you know what I've found now for 33 years, as I've read Dr. Jung's work, is that I find it healing to me at all times. And everything that I've read of Dr. Jung's has been healing to me. And understanding what he himself went through in his lifetime. I mean, he was not a perfect figure, as Dr. Carter is indicating here. He, you know, he had some issues, and you see those issues graphically in the photograph that I had earlier. Maybe I should show it one more time so that you can see it. But there was an issue because his chief disciple at the end of his life was Marie-Louise von Franz, and she has, in this book, which is supposed to be for laymen and you know, about Dr. Jung's life and what it meant, She doesn't identify any of these women except for Emma Jung. My goodness. So there were lots of internecine warfare going on in this whole group. Obviously, Freud and Jung fell out a year and a half after that photo was taken. But you know, we all go through very rough times in our lives, and you know, the question is, are you seaworthy? I mean, I'm a naval person because I grew up in the Navy and have done a lot of sailing in my life besides being a Marine. And the question is, do you have what it takes? And you can think of the movie Chariots of Fire from 80 or 81, where the British Olympic team the track and field team is getting ready to go to the Olympics. And there's a scene where Eric Liddell is running a quarter mile, and he does a voiceover during that scene where he says, "So where does the power come from to see the race through to the end? From within." And you know, I never thought I would be referring to that movie tonight, but that's the image that comes into my mind. And not only does the image come into my mind, but the dialogue too, as you see. And so what Dr. Jung's work is partially about is that very facility of being conscious of what's happening at any given moment. So I just demonstrated it for you because, you know, 2 minutes ago, I was not thinking about Chariots of Fire, not at all. But in the course of that discussion, boom, that image popped up, and then I tell you that story. And so we're about seeing the race through to the end, because when you get your degree, you've got the tools, but then you have to live your life, and that's a different kettle of fish altogether. And so,
well, and I think reading Dr. Jung, we're not prepared a lot of times when we go through these things. But I've always found that when I went through something, Dr. Jung helped out that it was okay to go through this thing, and helped me do that quite a bit. Because there's nobody that I knew of that could come and say, this is okay, this is the way it works, you know?
Right.
So that's what I love about Dr. Jung. So.
Right. So Chris,
I'll just add,
go ahead.
You know, like that little piece of prose or whatever we want to call it, where I say, you know, get my head cut off and move more forward, more heart-centered. Well, that's a manifestation of our talking about Jung. And, you know, now if I take those words and do as you've done and just put it into my calligraphy, such as it might be, and I just put that on my desk, then it'll keep me, reminding me of the need to be more heart-centered. So that's a manifestation out of Jung. And I'll just back right up. It was something intuitive in me when I first encountered Skip in only a comment that he made on Pastor Paul Vanderklay's channel. And whatever it was that he commented, it made me, you must have referenced that you've got a Carl Jung channel. So your creative work in your channel was shared with me in a comment on Pastor Paul Vanderklay's channel. I was motivated by intuition to go and search out, follow up. Well, who's this Jung, and why? Who's this guy Skip, and what's he saying? What he said? Why has he said that? And then, you know, another thing that you did at some point was talk about this art, and I was motivated, must have been very soon after first encountering you. I was motivated to actually create some symbolic icons, I'd say, just with pen and paper. And then you're discussing about the circle and the mandala, and then my encountering the concept of the circle with the indigenous people inspired me to arrange these symbols that I had done by hand with pen and paper into a circle. And so at some point I will share that, but at this point in time, it's still a work in progress. But anyway, that's just a quick sharing of intuition drawing me along to here we are today, right?
Right. So Montana Hovetter has said, do you have an example of your first-hand experience of God, and what was it like, and did you all feel that you were under a sort of compulsion? I lost that. Oh, by it. Montana, I have just given you the link, my link to my talk on this subject, which is Finding the Living God. And so I'm not going to go into it here, but I would urge you to take a look at that video. I would also urge you to listen to the playlist called Christian Individuation, which is about Nancy's life experience with God. And Nancy has a master's degree in Christian spirituality and has had a very long life experience of the living God and how it actually plays out in life. And so we have that whole playlist, which is there are actually 5 videos, about an hour and a half each, of Nancy's life with that. But also there are a couple of other videos that we did before we started that series, and I would urge you to go listen to those if you want to know about an experience of God. Any other comments in the panel? Or Nancy,
I'd like
go
to
ahead.
just quickly to say that when I had this experience of God that was very numinous, it was when I knew that God knew me personally and was not a general force or a general energy, but was connected to me. We were connected and we could communicate to each other. And it was in the beginning, it was very, I was filled with energy and I smiled so much, my face hurt. But it wasn't a compulsion. It was just a fullness of life more than I had ever known before. And it did, taper off. And then periodically over my life, I've had experiences similar to that. But it was wonderful. And it was about love.
Right. And the question partially is, did you feel under a compulsion by it? And I would give my answer would be that sometimes it's compulsion and sometimes it's grace. But
with compulsion being more of a ego in your head term, agreed, and grace being more of a divinity psyche zone, as some people, as Skip called it earlier. I get in the zone, I don't even know what I'm saying. So compulsion used in that sense almost sounded negative to me there, because it's what you want to get away from is a compulsion. You want it to sweep you up and take you without the brain being involved, which of course is the whole topic that's been discussed tonight.
Well, but you need both, because yourself is going to can change your life, and especially when there's an experience of God involved, and many numinous experiences have changed lives, and And so, you know, you can be doing something and all of a sudden, bango, there'll be some change, and you are then pulled in another direction. So last week I went through sort of my life experiences where I've really had to change my the way I address life many different times and ways. And so it's not only a compulsion, but it can be. But the issue is that there's two streams coming up from the unconscious. One's a good one and one's a bad one. And you have to have a strong enough ego if you're going to be properly individuated so that you live the life that you were fated to be. You have to have a strong enough ego so that you can decide for the good.
I saw a video, Nancy, you were in months ago. It was before I even had met Skip. You were, I don't remember the title of it, but I just want to tell you that you were a great inspiration to me going through some of the things you've been through, because I too am going through some of those things. And you have to believe that God is going to help you get you further than you can get yourself. I'll phrase it that way. But I want to thank you, Nancy.
Well, thank you,
I
Deborah.
was very inspired about how you blossomed and healed, and I believe that can only be done with God,
Right.
you, around you, guiding you.
So Montana goes on, what tips do you have for someone with depression? Now, we are not mental health professionals here, and so we're not going to give very serious mental health advice of any kind, because if a professional mental health person were to give that advice, they might offer some sort of pharmaceutical, and I am not going to do that under any circumstances. What I can say is that when I've been depressed, if I work on some creative activity, I work my way out of it, I would say. And it's been any number of things. I mean, when I wrote my novel, I was in my late 40s. I had lost the last job that I ever got, where I worked for someone else. And so I was quite depressed, and it's often trauma that causes numinous inspiration that leads you to do something else. It's often trauma of that kind that gets you through to doing something creative, which then you can be self-healing, because you will find your answer, whatever it is. And no one can tell you what that is, because we don't know what your experience is. But and even if we knew what your experiences is, we wouldn't do it on this discussion, because we're not mental health professionals.
I'd like to just share my experience with depression, which I've had a lot of over my lifetime.
Mm-hmm.
For women at certain ages, when the hormones are changing, that can produce some depression, and hormone replacement therapy, depending on what your doctor tells you, might be something that could help. If you can't get out of bed, if you find it, you just can't do anything, that's definitely a time to see a doctor. If you're having suicidal thoughts, it's very important to see a good counselor. And something that I have done is to try to get a figure, some kind of a figure for that depression. It might be a stone, just what image comes up, or what image can you give to that depression? Does it have jagged lines? Is it smooth? Is it round? Is it a different shape? Just very, very simple, but to put something down, or a little story, once upon a time, I was doing such and such, and this happened, and so forth. But some little way of acknowledging the depression, because these things can come to us as teachers. And if we acknowledge it without getting sucked down deep into it, it actually gives us a sense of breath, opens us up, and we feel better.
Yes, I agree. Sean says, for me, if you have a really tough decision, ask yourself, what is the price of my soul? Then instantly follow the feeling that comes after. I have if you have a red-blue decision, or any sort of duality decision, you can always flip a coin. Okay, and I don't say that facetiously, Deborah, because
You're serious.
I'm quite serious.
Flip a coin.
Flip a
that's
coin.
intuitive.
No, wait a minute. Listen to the process.
Okay.
You say, heads is this and tails is that. You flip the coin and you get the result. If your next instinct is to say, I'm going to go for best 2 out of 3, then you know that the decision you wanted is on the other side of that coin. Okay. But if you're satisfied with the result, then you know you're on the right side of the coin, and it works every time. It's infallible.
So you're using it to get to what it is that
you really want.
That you in your brain don't know which that is yet.
Your ego doesn't know, but your psyche knows.
Your psyche knows.
Right. And so when you flip the coin and you look at the first result, if you're happy with the result, that's your answer. If you want to go best 2 out of 3, you don't have to flip the best 2 out of 3. Your answer is on the other side of the coin. It's simple as that.
That's fascinating. Well, it's like the intuitiveness of knowing which tarot card to pick as well.
Sure.
We don't decide that. It decides for us, or the way we, and because of that, we get our answers, and it works.
Yep, that's right. That's right. Now, Chris said, thank you for answering my question about we're back on the violinist here so beautifully. I recommend listening to Christian Ferra's recording of Sibelius Violin Concerto. He tragically committed suicide later, i.e. he was burned. Yeah, I mean, I don't really want to talk about suicide on it right now because I don't think any of us are competent to discuss it. And if you have suicidal thoughts, I urge you to call a suicide hotline in the United States and anywhere in the world. Actually, you can reach one and get professional help. That isn't what we're about here, and I can't work with that. For me, if I have a really tough decision, okay, we got that. Then Montana says, do you all have an example of it? Okay, we did the example of God. Willaverse says, honesty of one's own is great for a great artist, although great art doesn't have to be difficult, highly intricate, or perfect. 3 chords can make a most beautiful song. Absolutely, I agree with that entirely. Something as simple is just as good as something really ornate. It just depends on what's happening with it, and then Montez, or that it is set at some sort of domino effect that you intimately had to follow. And R says the ending of the Inner Fire story is like Alan Watts on the guru tricking you, but as long as you can be tricked, you deserve it. I guess that's true. Montana says, this is a question for Nancy. Okay, we already addressed that. Okay, let me move down here. Let's see. Flea says, strong but gentle love, a tree that sheds leaves still lives despite winter winds. There were two wise men. One went out into town and never returned. The wiser man knelt, smoked his pipe alone at dusk. Not one soul knew him. Despite losing limbs, a tree that sheds leaves still lives despite being bare. A blessing, said he, to have a home by the forest where the spirits sleep, where the moon shines brighter still than city lights dampening the stars. Below heaven's gate, disarmed, sitting alone, man is truly home despite losing limbs, and a tree that sheds, I don't know, we're sort of repeating here. Small haiku that I wrote when I was going through some hard times. One thing I would make an observation about, the next segment of the Red Book, which I plan to read, is a chapter called The Anchorite. And the anchorites were people who literally went out into the desert and contemplated their navel or whatever. And so there's a major section in the Red Book about the anchorite. And it truly addresses, among other things, the difference between Dr. Jordan Peterson and Dr. Jung. And also Vervaeke. And so I urge you to listen to my readings of those. If I can find, I'm not looking at the Red Book, so I can't find it there. I urge you to look at my reading of that in full, but maybe I can find the segment I'm thinking of here.
While Skip's looking for that, I was just thinking of what Craig Nelson said, that the numinous is the one who beckons. The numinous is the one who beckons.
Mm-hmm.
And I'm thinking Deborah shared about her being called to poetry and writing. And I'm wondering, Jerome, how would you answer that? Like, insofar as, what's the numinous calling you to? Is there an art form that you're working on, or anything that you might want to share? I'm just curious.
Well, in terms of the numinous, there's all sorts of different, as Nancy says, you can experience different numinosities all along the journey here. And so
I guess I'm just wondering, what is it that what are you working on, I suppose? Like we know Skip very well as numerous endeavors and artistic creations and channels that he's creating on YouTube, and wondering a little bit about what makes Jerome tick.
Good question.
That's interesting. Yeah, what makes me tick? I don't know. Anyway, I've had a lot of experiences in terms of in my business world sense, was in terms of management development, leadership development, cultural changes, working with teams. So it's more been of a leadership position and that management background. And then the other realm would be in terms of getting in touch with my artistic side. So it's kind of, you want to develop both sides back and forth and be able to go from each side. I'll show you a picture here. Hold on just a minute. Okay. Whoops, got the wrong one. Okay, can you see that?
Beautiful.
Yes.
Okay.
Beautiful.
All right. Is it still on there? I can't see my
Yes.
screen.
Yep.
Okay. I took a raw piece of wood, white oak tree that my builder had cut down. We cut it up into rough cut wood lumber and let it dry out for 2 years. Okay.
Mm-hmm.
And then I took the rough lumber and I planed it down to the, so you're using the raw material here. Okay. And then I carved it. I came up with the design, and this was my design that came up, and this came up to me, and it was like, I love swans, and you can see how the swans are on each side.
Mm-hmm.
And you can also see a curve at the bottom, which is a what I would call a bridge between the two sides.
Yeah.
So this is my thinking in this, but at the same time, I have a full wood shop, Miles, and I've learned these skills over the years, and so that's one of my hobbies, and so I can be creative, and at the same time, and also you notice the curves on the sides. I had to chip that out like you'd do a canoe, the old-fashioned way, in order to get those curves on each side.
Beautiful.
And the little eyeballs there you see in the swans are walnut plugs. And I also follow the old Craftsman's type of processes. I don't use any nails at all.
I was just going to ask if the eyes were like a dowel, like would
Right.
be.
Yeah, it's a walnut dowel.
It's a walnut dowel. That's what I thought it was.
Out of a piece of walnut.
Mm-hmm.
And then this takes hours and precision, and you have to have a lot of patience.
So there's not a screw or a nail in that thing?
Nope. And it's sturdy because it uses dowels and glue, and it's the old-fashioned way. And then the
principle of the arch is in there.
Right. Mm-hmm. Yeah. So engineering wise, it's very sturdy.
That is gorgeous. Very
so
good. Well, thank you for sharing that.
Wow.
If you want to know what some of my was about, then that's just one of my hobbies. So
fantastic. Well, thank you for sharing that, because I had no concept that those were something you were involved with, is artistic woodwork like that. Yeah. It reminds me of my father. He's passed away a couple of years ago, and he was very creative with wood, and he just taught himself, self-taught. And for anybody listening, one of the things that he did is he just went often not often, but once went walking, I suppose several trips, collecting pieces of driftwood. And then he used the driftwood to fashion legs and made a table out of it. And it's still a treasured piece in our family, so it's a great concept of woodwork that you showed. Thank you very much, Jerome.
You're welcome. And it's one of a kind. It's an heirloom for my children.
I just want to go ahead.
Yeah, it's something that, you can't reproduce that or mass reproduce it. I'm not interested in that. It has a meaning to me, and I try to explain how the two sides coming together, it has a psychological component.
Yeah.
My father also, he was in the lumber business, but he also did work. He was very crippled with arthritis and also only had one eye, but made intricate, beautiful patterns on a jigsaw, which a one-eyed man is never supposed to be able to do. Mm-hmm. And so it's an example of when you have the fire in you of going beyond what you're supposed to be able to do and finding a way to do it anyway.
Yeah.
And I think that's the beauty of what you've done and what your father's done and what I saw my father do too.
Yeah.
Yeah, my father was had a shop, and he taught me a lot of the skills, and so I took and expanded upon that. But it takes practice and a lot of work before you ever get to that level.
And a lot of mistakes.
Oh, yes, yes,
Yeah.
yes.
I want to take special notice here. I want to come back to this in a moment, but we have a user on the chat who is the Love Doctor, and I won't identify her by name, but she is a member of our advanced reading group, and she lives in Australia and has been chased around by the fires for the last 2 months. And so, Love Doctor, we're very glad to see you here and actually participating with us tonight. And so I'm glad to see that you're well enough to do that, and you're set up again because climate change is real, and the Australians are really experiencing it in real time. Now, going back to the issue of meaning, Jerome mentioned that the chair has a great meaning to him. And the point about that meaning is that it cannot be defined. This is the fundamental problem with Jordan Peterson's logos orientation and John Vervaeke's overemphasis on logos as well. And I was looking for a snide comment that Dr. Jung made about professors and how they are all at each other's throats, but I won't do that. But the point is, John Vervaeke's done 50 videos on the quote unquote meaning crisis, and he hasn't really, I mean, okay, maybe he has, because in the last 2 minutes of video 50, he kind of says that he groks it, but he hasn't led anybody along to where he is by that. And my criticism of that entire series is that throughout that whole 50 video thing that he did, he's trying to define meaning. And the meaning he's talking about, the meaning crisis meaning, isn't definable, okay? The meaning is in things like Jerome just said. The meaning to him in terms of building that bench, or the meaning to me in producing this YouTube channel is undefinable. Okay, and it's part of experience. It's part of the eros, not part of the logos. There's no defining it. I'm sure if I really put the thumb screws to Jerome and said, you've got to write the meaning of that bench for me, you'd have to write encyclopedias, and you still wouldn't have gotten to the true meaning of that bench to you. And so do not look for the meaning of your life in things that you can define the way they are defining them. I mean, Jordan Peterson wants to rescue the logos. I'm here to be his counterpoint to rescue the eros, because meaning is about your life. Okay. And there was a great scene in The American President where Martin Sheen is being complained at for having a girlfriend, and he gets angry with his chief of staff because he said, or it's Michael Douglas, and Martin Sheen is his chief of staff, and so Michael Douglas is angry with Martin Sheen because Martin Sheen wants to do polling on whether he should have a girlfriend or not. And he says, you know, this isn't about what the people think. This is about my life, right? And that's the point, that you have to understand the difference. You have to understand what love is and that sort of thing. And those things are not definable. And even in the end of Memory Streams Reflections, I have it here because I'm going to talk about it momentarily. The very last thing that Dr. Jung talks about is the fact that he could never define love. And so anyway, we are well over the 2-hour limit here. So I don't know, shall we continue talking about this essay next time? What I can do is I can very quickly but relatively slowly scroll through this essay so that anybody who wants to read it can read it. So let me do that. And whoops, that's not it. Let me first of all get it identified here. All right.
I don't know if they can read it on the screen. We didn't get very far, so.
Yeah, we didn't get far. So, okay. So I'm just going to very slowly scroll through it. If you go to full screen on a computer, you may be able to read it. And so I'm just asking you to stop the video at each point and you can read it. You can also read my comments. Now, what is your preference, webinar participants, about whether we want to continue on with this next week, or shall we start with Memory Streams Reflections, which I promised Nancy?
I think we should complete this since we have some wonderful artists in the group.
Okay.
Well, I also think maybe we should complete it. There is a section in there that we talked about Jung being a designer, architect, landscape, stonemason, or a sculptor.
Right.
And the whole thing we've been talking about today is how things materialize through craft and work.
Right.
And using his hands. And that's kind of what I was interested in. And
right.
there are certain people in Myers-Briggs, which I'm an expert in, the intuitive thinking types and intuitive feeling types are all, if you're an architect, you're going to be in one of those categories.
Right.
And the intuitive thinking architect, you might have a cold structure, and an intuitive feeling architect, you'll have a warm structure.
Right. Okay. So
but anyway, that's kind of what I was saying. Maybe we should continue that.
Okay. So
I'd like to
go ahead,
say
Nancy.
I'd like to also say continue, because I think the history of Jung's young life and what's behind, he suffered as a child. And I think what she has to say about his life psychologically would be helpful, perhaps.
I'd be very interested in that. As I say, I've been working with children, but also I would be very interested in that.
Yeah. Now, Nat's Ghost draws me up here, and she's quite right. She says, I feel that Logos and Eros both need to be saved, valued, honored. I get confused by either or. Am I missing something? No, you're not. You're correct. We need to have the balance between the two. And what's happened over the last, let's say, 300 years is we've become way overbalanced on the Logos. And that probably goes back 1,500 years. Mm-hmm. And we have to come back to understanding what these things actually are, and what God is, and and how we can live a fuller life. I mean, is it John 10:10 where he says, I came to so that you can live in abundance, not so, right? And
Yeah, my saying is it's either or. Instead of either or, it's both and.
yeah, it's both and I do agree with that. So I probably was a little bit trenchant in how I said it. That's Ghost, and you're quite right to remind me. R says, MDR is the book I got instead of the red book, but I'm down for letting my unconscious book onto your art talk. Okay. Jerome, do you want to comment on MDR, and then I'm going to comment on it?
On MDR?
Yeah, because you had some comments about it being Angela Yaffe's writing.
Yeah, Angela Yaffe wrote the autobiography of Jung, and she edited it quite briefly.
Just say for everybody that we're talking memories, dreams, and reflections.
Yeah,
that's what MDR is.
Yeah, right. That's
okay, so this is MDR.
They're saying it's Jung thought she ought to put her name on it as the author because it did not reflect what he would think of would be his autobiography.
Okay, well,
that being said, you should read it in terms of that it may be biased from her standpoint, and there may be some things you may not hear about, and that's why several authors like Deidre Barr have written kind of a book about Jung, and it's not in the overly positive sense in terms of the way MDR is. But MDR is still valuable.
Okay,
I'd like to just say
go ahead. Yeah.
And
Nancy.
I could be wrong here. Please correct me if I'm wrong. But my understanding was that at 80% or more are actually his words.
In MDR, you're saying?
Yes. That's
okay.
what I've heard.
Here's the way it came down, and here's what's going to happen in 2020. She recorded in private sessions with Dr. Jung over about a 10-month period, lots of his reflections. Okay, so maybe it's not word for word for Dr. Jung, and it is definitely stated by the whole Jungian community that it was heavily edited by the family. Okay, I acknowledge that. As I understand it, there are 3 passages that Dr. Jung personally wrote and were his, which are the 2 or 3 of the beginning chapters and the last chapter, the late thoughts chapter.
I have the same understanding. It's only 3 sections.
Right. Okay. So for beginners, I don't recommend the red book. Okay, because in terms of Dr. Jung's work, I don't recommend the red book because it's very important to understand the red book in context. And Jungian analysts didn't even have the red book. Even the analysts didn't have it until 2009. And so all of Jungian psychology up until 2009 had developed without the red book entirely. Okay. And it's, in terms of understanding it in context, it's a very beautiful work of art, and it's a very beautiful work of psychology. But it's at least in the intermediate stage of understanding Dr. Jung's oeuvre. Okay. And so I feel strongly that anybody that's starting with Dr. Jung's work should read Man and His Symbols, which he intended to be for laymen, first of all, and Memories, Dreams, Reflections, not because it's his own direct work, but because it sort of covers the main things in his life. Now, in 2020, the protocols are going to be published. The protocols have been published. I have them in German. Okay, so there is a German version of the protocols, which is what Agnella Jaffe's actual shorthand notes were from what Dr. Jung said to her. I have it in German. I don't read German, so I haven't read it, but it's 800 pages long. This book is 350 pages long. So obviously a lot has been left out of this book. Nonetheless, I feel that it is extremely useful for having a perspective on this particular man, Carl Jung, and what he was concerned about. And this is really a biography of the development of his psyche. It's not about the development of his life in a biographical sense, in a historical biographical sense. It's not what happened to Carl Jung on December 28th, 1913. Well, we now know, thanks to the Red Book, historically what happened to him, but that's not what was important to him during his lifetime. He had experiences that, as a psychiatrist and a long-term clinical psychologist, he thought were important to the development of his way of thinking. And so for that reason, I think it's useful to go through the MDR. Now, MDR does have an excellent reading of it on audible.com. And so I urge you to go out to audible.com and buy that reading by Robert Bethune. It's a beautiful reading, and you can listen to it while you're driving in the car. I'm not going to read the book online because Robert Bethune has done such a beautiful job of it, and I only wish he would have done more. And I waited for about 10 years before I started to read Jungian books, hoping that he would come out with more, because he also read Psychology of the Unconscious, and that's a beautiful reading as well. But I think in terms of, in this kind of a context where we are now, not in the advanced reading group, but in this general group, where we're trying to make people aware of Dr. Jung and his oeuvre and what his place historically in the development of human psychology is, it's a very useful book, MDR is. And Agnella Jaffe was one of the four main central women who were among the Valkyries who actually started the Carl Jung Institute in Zurich, and so she was extremely committed to Dr. Jung for decades, and so she had a lot of wisdom about it and what should be said. Now, I readily acknowledge that this was censored by the family at the time it was published in 1956 or whatever, and by Dr. Jung himself. But it's a good generic place to start. And then this year, we're going to have the protocols, and it'll be very interesting to see how that may differ from MDR. But we should all look for that and expect to buy a copy when it's available in our language. Jerome, do you have objection to that per se?
No, I'm fine. Yeah, I would also recommend Map of the Soul by Murray Stein.
I was just going to say that. I was just going to ask Skip if he used that book, because that's the one I know the most.
Well, Map of the Soul is an excellent book, and that too is available on audible.com. I purchased it in that form and listened to it twice in that form. And then when BTS came out, I purchased the actual book and went through and read it in detail. And I can tell you that it's better in the actual hard book to read it, because it's very rich.
Yeah, I prefer reading myself.
Why?
But
My vision isn't so hot, so I don't
oh,
read things unless I have to.
yeah, well, these editors' eyes have had their toll, but
Right.
still doing it. You notice me taking the
Right.
But
But Map of the Soul by Murray Stein is an outstanding book too, and as an overview.
I thought it gave a lot. It gave a lot of his, and he mentioned that in the introduction. I did see it through the book. It mentioned a lot of. Some people think that Jung had contradictory things that he said, depending on where he was in his life, and they really weren't contradictory. They were more complex nature. They had layers to them. I thought that came out well in that version, Map of the Soul.
Yeah, I found that understanding what is meant by soul and by spirit and by psyche has been a quandary for me over a long while.
Because it's going to change depending on what you're going through in life and what.
Precisely. I do agree with that, right.
Jung is no exception to that. We can't be 100% think everything exactly the same way every minute of the day. Things are going to balance and unbalance.
So how would you define the soul? Any of you, Jerome, any of you? How do you define the soul? I mean, it's obviously key to the quote that I was working with earlier in this session.
Well, the soul to me is what I rely on. Is my, it's me.
It's your foundation.
Yeah, it's me. And then what emerges from that, if I listen to it, I'm fine. If I don't, I'm not fine. So
yeah.
But as I agree with what Deborah says, it evolves over time. And that's what Jung was doing. And I think we go through these different stages, and that's what the individuation process is.
Right. And it's fascinating to me I've been reading his oeuvre, and for the first 15 years, I was working with Jung sort of vicariously. Okay. I read Man and His Symbols, and then I was reading a lot of Jungian analysts that were talking about him, but I wasn't reading him. But then when I started to read him directly, I said, oh my God, how much have I missed here? And once you get, and this takes 5 to 10 years, if you're lucky. It took me more than that, but 5 to 10 years. If you read through the entire collected works, then you can understand why things happened at a specific time, especially if you're familiar with the history of the 20th century and the context of him living in between all these nations that were enemies of the Allies, both in World War I and World War II, and what he was facing in his own lifetime in terms of his exigent experiences. He was a very lucky man. I mean, one wag said that he married well and had a lifetime of an extended working vacation type thing. But it's not quite that simple. And he obviously worked very hard during his lifetime, no doubt about it.
I would like to say, building on that, and borrowing from Professor John Vervaeke, he talks about something that we have, certainly us gathered here and people tuning in, is a need that we have an inherent or an intrinsic caring center. Like, why do we care that we even, come onto this channel, right? Unless we cared about truth and peace, we would probably just be watching some frivolous television right now, or, who knows what diversions we could have, games on our devices and playing Candy Crush or whatever it is. And I guess that's what I'm really concerned about, is how many people aren't really caring, or it just seems they're not really caring about truth and peace.
They're not well connected really with what's really going on. That's the problem.
But it's not just truth, and it's not just truth and peace. I see it as a step further. This caring is caring for other people.
Well, one thing is they don't have a life. Okay. In other words, if you spend your time sitting in front of the television set, it's vicarious. You're not having the life. The person, either the character is having a life, or the football players on the football field are having a life, but you aren't having a life. You're just having you're a spectator of life. And so the question is, how do you have a life? Now, in terms of this group, I have some thoughts about that. And that is that we build unconscious connections. I mean, not so much with this group because I lead it, but with my meditation group, my Buddhist meditation group, there are 5 women psychologists in the group. One Tibetan Buddhist actual Lama who comes in robes when he comes, and then 3 or 4 other people in this group. And, I live with a Tibetan Buddhist Lama, so it's not like I need it for getting educated about Buddhism. And the psychologists are not interested in Jungian because they're interested in ADHD and other issues that aren't really.
Well, as you heard me talk about, and what I realize, and it's interesting that I found your group, because what I read about Jung, and that is what you were just saying a couple minutes ago. I read about Jung, about that's what you study when you get a degree in psychology, is you hear what the experts say about him. You don't actually read the red book. You don't actually read Jung's words other than the quotes about it.
And what I thought was
so I found that when I actually started reading his words, I had the same experience you did in this.
Yeah, and I thought it was about clinical psychology, honestly. I mean, I thought his main work was his how-to of clinical psychology, and I didn't want to be.
That's all I knew until, let's say, about 5 years ago. I got interested in actually.
But then, when you actually read his work, it's not about clinical psychology at all, really.
It's about the soul.
It's about the soul, and it's about religion, and it's about art and lots of other things.
The one talk, it's in movie docudrama form. It's called the Young the Heretic. I don't know if you've seen that. It's a talk that was given by some professor somewhere, but it's been out for a long time, and it's very well known. And it talked about how he got involved, and that caused a lot of the big split between he and Freud. Was Jung was involved in the intuitive, in synchronicity, in what we've been talking about tonight. And of course, Freud definitely was not. But calling, Jung the heretic, he was interested in the tarot and those kind of things. And that's what made him so different, because he had such a broad spectrum.
Right.
You don't get when you're studying psychology and theology. At least I didn't 30 years ago.
Well, and
don't get that at all.
Definitely now. Yes, definitely. But the point I was going to make about my meditation group is there's a unconscious connection there that I cannot deny. And while I am, I'm unable to really talk to these psychologists about Jungian psychology, they're not interested in it. And I don't need their help with Buddhism. Nonetheless, I've been going to this group now for 4 years, and I've given up trying to figure out why I go. I just go, and it's unconscious, and I know that there's an unconscious connection between me and those mostly women. There's one other man in the group, but I know there's a connection between us. I haven't been able to define it. I'm not sure I ever will, but those things do happen. And this is Jung's concept of the collective unconscious, obviously, too, which we all have to be aware of, that anytime you're in a group, you're going to develop unconscious connections with that group.
And you have a soul connection with that.
Yeah, absolutely. Absolutely.
Which is a beautiful thing, because you know each other at a depth that you don't even realize the depth of it.
Well, and I think this format helps with that, in that we can see each other, for one thing. And whereas I was on the old Jungian group, chat page for a long time. We had an old chat group, and we would talk Jungian stuff back and forth like we're doing here. But you didn't see the person. You couldn't really, really take a look and see who you are and express, and we're able to share all this back and forth. On a chat, you can't really do that because.
No. I mean, I'm a writer, and I really am a very descriptive writer, but still, seeing a person, seeing their face, like just the way, when you speak, the way you hold your hands, it shows a certain strength in like you're giving to us, and those nuances of things, and just the way Skip's face lights up, the way Nancy glows when she speaks. I mean, I thank you so much for inviting me here tonight, because this is the first time I've done this. And yes, you get so much more out of it when you can, seeing Miles with his paint on. I mean, that was symbolic, and what a great way and seeing Skip's dragons.
Yeah.
Right.
I thought Miles had been in an accident when I first saw him.
I wasn't sure what that was. I was like, okay.
Yeah.
That's why I felt I best explain it.
I just wanted to say thank you to Deborah, too, how much you've brought to the group with your enthusiasm and your background and experience.
Yeah, please come back and join us.
No,
I
am.
Join
I have a lot going on right now. I'm getting ready to get my legs sawed off and turned into titanium in about 10 days, 9 days.
Yeah.
Skip did that, I think.
Yeah, I did it once back in 2017. And
well, I've had this one done twice, and I went to a class today and was very excited because it's so much easier now than it was then. And I'm going to have some downtime.
Yeah. Well, they have pain under control these days. I learned that.
Yeah. Yes. And so I'm really ready to get it done, because I'm in so much pain now they can't control it with anything. So I've gotten to that point. Just since you saw me a week ago, I now have a stress fracture in the lower leg.
Oh yeah. Okay, so next week we will continue with
Thank you, Nancy.
With Dr. Carter's essay. And at some point in the future, when we finish working through Dr. Carter's essay, which I think is very important, then we'll go to this Memory Streams Reflections, as Nancy requested, which I think is quite useful, but it's we have to understand it for what it is. It's a way to put us into the Jungian mindset, and in terms of his life experience and what he, in general, thought what were the important facts of his life, which did not involve dates and that sort of thing, which most
For me, it was the first Jungian writing I read, and it got me interested in Jung, and it began to open up my intuitive side and teach me about dreams, and that life had a lot more to offer than the life I was living. So the message of the book and of his life, I think, is quite useful.
Right. Now, the essay that we've been talking about tonight has been from this book, Jung's Red Book for Our Time, Searching for Soul Under Postmodern Conditions.
Okay.
And it is volume 3.
Okay.
And it's the essay by Dr. Linda Carter.
Linda Carter, right.
Right. And
quick question for Jerome, real quick. When you were talking about the part in the essay about being the sculpture and the woodworker and the carpenter and that sort of thing, do you think, or do any of you think like I do, that everything we do doesn't have to be what we do with our hands? Everything we do, whether I'm doing a chapter in a book or whether I'm doing there's structure and in sculpture, we sculpt everything, ideas, concepts. Does anyone else feel that way, or do you strictly relate what's in that essay? Since I have not read it, do you strictly relate it to the actual pick and shovel realism, or does it relate to concepts? Does it relate to the soul? Does it relate to, I mean, everything we do
it relates to everything we do.
Yeah, what I can say is this, that in my business world, when I was running groups, this was present in the group. It was creation.
Okay, so that, yes, so you used it as leadership as well. So yes,
and it was coming not from me, ego. It was coming from somewhere else.
And soul.
And it can be felt by the group, and the group coalesced.
Exactly.
It was beautiful. Okay. So I'm creating art in business.
Yes. Well, I was a supervisor for many years with a lot of different disciplines for the Army.
And you can tell that. I mean, it's a feeling. You can really sense it in the whole
You can
group.
feel when it comes together.
That's it. Yeah.
Right.
Now, so that takes the essay now instead of into a much broader scope. So.
Right. Yeah. Right.
Thank you.
So Nat's Ghost makes a comment. I'm exhausted. I've returned to a place where I'm rebuilding and growing and working hard. I'm up past my bedtime, but this gives me energy. I appreciate connecting with everyone. It's bolstering. And by the way, Nat's Ghost and all other people that are on the YouTube chat, if you're interested in being part of our webinar, and therefore having your face be seen and so on, you're welcome to write to me at skip.conover@gmail.com, and we'll add you to this actual conversation. I have room for 100 of you if you want to come. And she says, when you initially define more nuanced and refined disambiguations of anything, but especially consciousness, people don't like it. I'm not quite sure what she means by that. Montana says, same here, Nats. This type of lingo amongst most people I know would seem bizarre. Yes, it does seem bizarre to almost everyone. There was a question a little earlier about when the logos took over and became overbalanced. And the answer is it became overbalanced from the writing of the book of John in the Bible. John 1:1 says, in the beginning was the Word, and the Word was with God, and the Word was God. And it seems that many Christian theologians from that time on, and probably for centuries before that, lost the fact that in John 1:4, I believe it is, they start talking about the light and the life. And so the point is that the logos, there's no life in the logos. And Dr. Jung expressively and explicitly says that in the segment about the anchorite, which I'm going to read tomorrow onto the YouTube channel. And so that's what we've been missing, and we've been missing it for at least 2 millennia that I can point to with clarity. And also, if you haven't done it, I urge you to take a look at the interview I did with Sophie Lacour. I have only edited the first 1/3 of that interview, but the part that I did edit has a very interesting passage, about 15 minutes, starting at about 26 minutes into it, about 26 and a half minutes into it, which is a reading which I did of Plato's Symposium. And it's very, very interesting what Plato knew and was talking about, including...
I did watch some of those. There were 3 in a series you did with Sophie, right?
Well, there's going to be 3.
Because I know I watched one entirely. This is before I met you, and I was just watching videos on
right. Well, this is a video that we just did on January 4th, and I just posted a couple days ago, and so if
I'll look for that one.
Yeah. So anyway, listen to that bit by Plato, which is very interesting, talking about homosexuality and a bunch of other interesting topics, which are still current today. And Plato lived 400 years before Christ. And so it's not like we have all the wisdom here. The wisdom has been being passed.
That was really very interesting. I really enjoyed your interview with Sophie. Yeah, I highly recommend it. I'd also like to just quickly address the question Deborah had about, the different forms of creativity. It doesn't just have to be working with our hands or woodworking or sculpting or even writing. It occurs to me that something that's very creative is actually putting on a little event. That can be, because I'm thinking I have inherited from my mother all these teacups, very, very delicate, different colored teacups, which are really from a bygone era when people, got together for tea, or they had tea services and such. And I'm just thinking how one of the previous indigenous people's events that I attended was a tea ceremony, and so maybe that's something people might consider doing is just calling people over for tea and maybe trying to create a little bit of ceremony around it.
Instead of sitting in front of the TV and watching football, right?
Yeah, that's right.
Or
the question is, are you going to get into life, or are you going to live vicariously through someone else's life?
I wish that I had many, many more years and many, many more hours to reach out to all the creative endeavors that I have. I mean, the list of things I want to do is huge, but I am finding that I'm getting so much out of this.
Right. Well, that's great to hear.
And it's getting quite late, everybody. Are we ready to kind of close this up?
Almost. There's a couple more comments here on the chat I want to.
Have we broken the record yet for longest interview? Longest session? 2:40.
Yeah, maybe we're close to 3 hours now. But
all right, we've broken the record.
Very quickly. RS, when will the Anchorites video be done? And the answer to that is probably tomorrow at 11 a.m. I'm going to read the Anchorites, which is chapter 6 of Liber Secundus of the Red Book. And if you're in our Dropbox, you can have access to that. And why Jung had to hide his work? Well, he was working on things that the church wouldn't have liked. And if he had said these things in the previous century and before, he might well have been burned at the stake. Maybe not the previous century, but in the 17th century would have been. And then Arsa, did Jung write about the Gnostics a lot? Well, he wrote about the Gnostics. There are a lot of people who want to diss Jung, who say he was a Gnostic. I don't believe that personally. I do understand that the Gnostics were about experience, and certainly Dr. Jung was about experience rather than logos. But
well, you have to be careful about the Gnostics that Jung was talking about was the Gnostics from Palisades in Alexandria.
mhm.
And he wasn't talking about the other Gnostics that he was only talking about. And he actually titled his 7 sermons to the dead by Palisades from Alexandria. So,
Right. Yes.
that's his pen name. So
Yeah. You later. Go ahead. Yeah. Okay. And Brandon Burt asks, what did Jung think was the cause for depression? I don't know. That's beyond my pay grade. If we're talking about the financial depression of the 30s, he might have had some comments, but very few.
That's a good way to evade an answer.
Right. This is none of us are mental health professionals, so we're not going to address
I
that.
love what you can do with words. You can massage them.
Yeah. Okay. So thank you for joining us all. We still, believe it or not, we still have 27 people watching on YouTube Live, which is actually quite a few.
hello.
And so there have been lots more. Usually when I have 25 live, it means we've had maybe 150 to 200 people check
They
in.
can see us and everything. Oh no!
Oh yes.
Oh no!
It's live. And so next time, Deborah, you should
I'll comb my hair next time.
No, bring up another window so that you can watch the YouTube channel, because this is being broadcast live around the world.
Yeah, I had no idea this was even happening tonight. I was in the middle of editing for a client. I switched from the client's paper to my email, and it was from you. And so I opened it and it said, you're invited to Zoom. And so I just clicked on. I mean, I'm sitting here on my couch. As I said, my hair isn't even combed. And so now you're telling me that 25 people are watching me?
Right.
All right.
Well, no, probably a couple of hundred, So Kevin Hastings asked a trenchant question, though, which is, what can you do to find and understand your archetype? And Kevin, I would urge you to take a look at 2 books by Jean Shinoda Bolen. One is called Gods in Every Man, and the other is called Goddesses in Every Woman. And in that, she outlines the 4 or 5 main archetypes that men and women experience in their lifetime. And so if you read those 2 books, you're going to get a very good overall view of what human archetype is and which one most relates to you. And
I'll just say goodbye because I got a warning. My battery's dying and I've got to go get the cord. So I'll just say bye.
Okay,
Thanks, everybody.
Peace. Good night.
Watch your head.
Yeah.
And Brandon says, what did Jung think of Kant? Well, I don't know what Jung thought, but Edinger said all Jungians are good Kantians. So I don't know what that means. And thank you to the Love Doctor for being with us tonight. And I'm very grateful to see that you've been here for so long and that you've been able to do that, because she's been dodging fires in Australia for months now. And Montana says, hold on a second. Does a single individual embody one singular archetype? No, you can have more than one archetype. And in my case, the two that apply most to me are Hermes, which is Mercury, and that's the god that brings things up from the underworld, so from the unconscious. And that's been a part of my life for 30 years, well, my whole life, I guess. And the other is Hephaestus, who is Vulcan. And Vulcan was the man that created things. And so I've created this YouTube channel, among many other things that I've created in my lifetime. So it's very natural archetype that plays through me. So you can have more than one. And others can apply as well in certain circumstances. Certainly, when I was serving actively in the U.S. Marine Corps, I was part of the warrior archetype, which is sort of a sub-archetype. But anyway, and Mandetta says, I think Hermes and Hades are two bad boys. And you're quite right about that. I've also been known as the trickster. That's another one. And Hermes was always getting in trouble because, as was observed earlier on the chat, it's hard to talk about this in polite company because nobody wants to cope with it. And so, but I think as of this week, we will have about 7,800 subscribers to this channel. And so that means more and more people are getting interested in it and talking about it. And certainly BTS, the K-pop group, is talking about this explicitly. And they have 80 million followers. So, and Kevin asked, what are sub-archetypes? I think I'm going to pass on that, Kevin, because I'm not quite clear what you're talking about. And we've now been on for 3 hours, so we need to terminate this session, and I hope it makes it onto YouTube. But anyway, I have also recorded it on my home computer, so I may be able to cut it up if YouTube kanks it for some reason. And
well, I'm gonna say goodbye. So
yeah, I'm going to say goodbye. Thank you.
I'm going to say goodbye.
Thank you for being here, ladies. Good night, and good night, everyone. I'll be on
nice
the chat.
Meeting you, Deborah. So
I'll be on the chat for another minute or two on the YouTube side. So talk to you soon.
Okay.
Happy New Year, and thank you for being here.
Well, thank you for inviting me.
Yeah, you're welcome.
thanks.